And welcome to Catholics Coast to Coast. I'm Ace McKay, loving the weekends when we get a chance to catch up and catch our breath, especially when it comes to conversations happening at Podcast Central. You might find some great ones to help deepen your walk and understanding of God this week. And before we do that, we, of course, each and every time want to check into our Mass reading so we get a true understanding of God's Word. So let's first start off checking in with your word on the Word.
Have you ever thought about how Adam felt when he named all of the animals God created?
I would have been overwhelmed. Like, how do you even know how to talk?
Or did they even understand him? The first reading for this Sunday comes from the book of Genesis, and we hear about the creation of Eve, the first woman.
Adam named all of the other creatures, but he still felt alone. He knew that he was different.
God cast a deep sleep upon the man and formed a woman out of Adam's rib. When Adam woke up, he immediately praised her, crying out, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh."
She was made from his own body, not the ground like the animals.
Men and women complement one another. Through their unity, they're able to create a whole new unique human being, with God's help, of course.
This story shows that humans are created for a relationship with God and each other. We can feel unfulfilled if we're missing one or the other.
Your challenge this week is to thank God for creating you. He loves you more than you'll ever know.
And we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Toodles.
Better understanding and reflections as your word on the Word does each and every week. If you want to get caught up, maybe there was a week that you missed or one that really has been ruminating in your mind and your heart and your soul. You can find out more of this at EWTN.com/podcast or wherever you like to stream. You can just search for Word on the Word. I'm Ace McKay. As Catholics Coast to Coast continues, we are going to Springs in the Desert. And this week, Katie Axelson sharing her astonishing story of survival where God is touching and healing our wounds with such a tender mercy and love. So Katie sharing her story today on Catholics Coast to Coast.
Welcome to the Springs in the Desert podcast. We're those friends that you can take with you wherever you are on the path of infertility. Hey listeners, this is Jillian. I just wanted to let you know that this episode contains a personal story, a personal testimony of a woman who had a high-risk pregnancy, and it entails a story of quite a bit of medical trauma. And so if this is not a story that you are prepared to listen to at this moment, that's okay. We just encourage you to hit pause, and you can go back and listen to a different episode and come back to this at a later time if that's what you would like to do. But I do truly think that this episode is relatable to so many different seasons of infertility. So if you're at a space that you are able to listen to this episode, then I encourage you to do so, and we would love to hear from you afterwards. Thank you so much for being here, and it's an honor to walk with you. Hey there, welcome back to the Springs in the Desert podcast. I'm Jillian, your host, and I'm really excited today to be talking with you with a new team member and someone that you're going to get to know very dearly, not only through this podcast, but through several other avenues in the Springs community. I have Katie Axelson today. How are you, Katie?
Good. How are you?
I'm so good. Listeners, this episode is going to be the start of a series of stories. We hear from you all the time that you really appreciate hearing personal stories because it helps you identify and process your own and see where God is working in your own story, wherever you are on the path of infertility. And Katie has been so generous to share her story. And I've heard bits and pieces, but I cannot wait to have it all together and to hear her heart. So I think we should just dive right in, Katie. Could you, first of all, introduce yourself a little bit and then just start wherever you would like with your story and how it relates to Springs? Maybe when did you get married and where did your journey of infertility begin?
Yeah. So my husband and I have been married for, it'll be 7 years this November. We got married pretty young. I was 21 when we got married and a very recent convert to the Catholic faith. Very fresh. I had no faith background at all when I met my husband. And it was like a whirlwind of God really, truly coming after my heart in a very intentional way. And yeah, I knew before we got married that I had some hormonal issues going on. My cycles were really just not regular. So we knew that we would likely have some issues conceiving. So in marriage prep, we met with the Creighton educator, and there were some red flags that initially popped up. And she recommended that we get into a NAPRO doctor, that I do that before getting married so that we can get the ball rolling and getting my hormones checked out. So we got married and we wanted to start a family right away. And I got into our local NAPRO doctor fairly quickly after we got married. There was a pretty long wait list after like the initial call.
Yes, I think that unfortunately is fairly common. Yeah.
Yeah, so we got in and they're like, there's definitely some red flags here. I was going like 70 days without a cycle, having significant amounts of pain. I would have 2 weeks out of every month where I wasn't like in a lot of pain. So they recommended that we move forward with a surgery to see if there's endometriosis going on or what it looks like internally. So we got married in November and I had that surgery in August. And I was diagnosed with endometriosis and PCOS. They weren't anticipating PCOS at first because my initial hormone levels, other than progesterone deficiency, looked fairly good, but my ovaries were very polycystic in appearance. And they recommended that we try to conceive pretty quickly after the surgery. And we found out we were pregnant with our daughter the first cycle after. And it just felt like a major answer to prayers because also that month our local NAPRO doctor was leaving and we weren't going to have a NAPRO doctor locally anymore. So it just really felt like a God moment for us. Okay, God really came through for us here. I needed progesterone injections from the get-go. My progesterone was very low and we were really excited. Everything was great. And then at 7 weeks, the night before my sister-in-law's wedding, actually, I started bleeding. And I was very high risk for ectopic pregnancy and I hadn't had a scan yet. So they had us go to the hospital just to make sure everything looked okay. And they diagnosed me with a subchorionic hemorrhage. So I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's basically like a little bruise or like a blood clot behind the placenta. There's typically no big deal. They're very common. This was really small. They're like, this isn't an issue at all. You'll probably bleed for a little bit. It'll resolve. No big deal. You don't need to do bed rest, nothing like that. We're like, okay, great. This is the best news possible. We were expecting worst case scenario. So we go on with the weekend and I just keep bleeding heavier and heavier. So I get into my OB on like Monday or Tuesday. And same thing, they do a scan. They're like, yep, no big deal. It's 2 centimeters, really small. We're not super worried about it. Just call us if anything gets worse. And then in the middle of the night, I started bleeding very heavily. They got us right back in the next day and the subchorionic hemorrhage had tripled in size overnight. So it went from like 1 to 2 centimeters to 7 or 8 centimeters. And they're like, okay, this is a bigger deal now. You're bleeding really heavily. We want you on very strict bed rest because every time I would get up, I would just start to bleed. And the CAT has come in 2 days later and it had grown to 12 centimeters. And they said, and my HCG had plateaued. There was still a heartbeat, but my HCG wasn't rising. We had this bleeding and they said, we want to prepare you that it's really likely you're going to miscarry. The blood clot's too large. It's going to push the baby out. So in the meantime, we want you to do very strict bed rest. They said they didn't want me up for more than 5 minutes a day to try and minimize the blood loss. And only get up to grab food, go to the bathroom. That's it. Otherwise, we want you laying down. So that's what we did. And we came home and we went and got a special blessing with some relics at one of our local churches. We just gave it to God and we really turned to the Our Father. And that's a really big theme with our story is the Our Father. And I remember this was again leading into a weekend. So I ordered, I'm wearing it. I wear it every day. I've worn it every day since. It's a bracelet and it says, Thy will be done. And that just became a really big theme for us with this was Thy will be done, whatever that may be. And every time we would go in for a scan, there would be a heartbeat. And she would still be fighting. And we had been praying for specifically the intercession of St. Philomena. The entire process, it took us about a year to conceive her. So we were praying for the intercession of St. Philomena that entire time. I had a dream when we were engaged that we would have a little girl. And in the dream, I delivered her and they put her in my arms. And I remember looking down at her and I'm like, this is Philomena. And so we knew if we ever had a little girl, her name would be Philomena. So we knew when we were trying to conceive, this is the saint we need to pray. We need to pray for her intercession. So it's amazing to see how much of a fighter our daughter is. Even from 7 weeks pregnant, she was hanging on in like dire circumstances. And every time we'd go to an appointment, and I was going for a while there, I was going twice a week for them to really keep up on the bleeding, to pay close attention to it. And every time we'd go, there would be a heartbeat, and the pregnancy, thanks be to God, kept progressing, and my HCG started rising again. And it really felt like a miracle. And I was on bed rest up until about 22 weeks like that. And then the bleeding slowed and the hemorrhage resolved. And eventually I passed it. And we were like, this is great. This is the miracle we've been asking for. And then at 26 weeks, my blood pressure skyrocketed. It was like over something. And my doctor was concerned. She had me go in. They gave me fluids. They're like, I really don't think anything's wrong. Maybe it's just stress. And then 2 days later, this was February 22nd. I was laying in bed and I rolled over and I felt a pop and then a gush. And I was like, oh no, did I just pee my pants or did my water break? Like, there's no way my water broke. My husband, at the time, we were opening the restaurant that we run. It was like we were putting ovens in and getting everything set up. So he was there and I was at home alone. And I'm like frantically Googling. I'm like, okay, how do I know if this was my water or if it was pee before I go to the hospital? Because at that point, we'd been to the doctor and the hospital so many times for issues that I was like, I don't want to go unless it's seriously an emergency. So I went and I was like, I'm gonna test the pH. I got pH strips. And I'm like, I'm gonna see. And it like came back positive. And I'm like, nah, it's just a faulty strip. No way. So then I call my aunt and my mom and I'm like, maybe not. So they come over and they're sitting with me while we're trying to decide if I want to go in. And I call my doctor and they're like, this is like a maybe 5% chance that your water broke this early. I'm sure it's fine. Unless you start having contractions, I think it's okay to wait and see. And then as soon as I got off the phone, the contractions started and the bleeding started again. So we get to the hospital and still haven't called my husband. And they're like, they get me in a room and they test it and they're like, yeah, your water is broken. They do a sonogram and we find out it's a complete rupture. So you can sometimes when your water breaks, it can tear a little bit like at the top and there's a chance for it to reseal. Mine was a complete rupture of membranes. I had 1 or 2 centimeters of measurable fluid left. By the time I got to the hospital, I was losing so much fluid that it was obvious it was my water. And I finally call my husband and I'm like, I'm at the hospital. My water broke. Probably should come up here now. And they let us know that they would be admitting me to the hospital until I delivered the baby. And that they were going to give me magnesium to, first of all, it helps with preventing brain like hemorrhages in premature infants, but it also can help calm the uterus with contractions. But they did let us know that if my body showed signs of wanting to go into labor, they weren't going to stop it because there's so many risks of infection. So I was contracting pretty regularly. Philomena was not handling them well. Her heart rate kept dropping. They would run into the room and flip me and like all these things. But about 24 hours later, the contraction stopped and I wasn't making any changes. Like I wasn't dilating. So they moved me to antepartum. And the plan was to hopefully make it to 34 weeks, which is when they would induce me, because at that point it would be safer for Philomena. She'd have a better chance of surviving and they wouldn't be prolonging the risk of infection for me. So I was on antepartum and they do heart rate checks and contraction checks 3 times a day, all day long. If you get up to go to the bathroom, you have to immediately call them. They have to come check the baby's heartbeat. It was an even stricter bed rest than before. We were getting weekly scans with maternal fetal just to check on like placenta, baby, fluid levels, all the things. I was really fortunate. There was a nun who I got really close with. Her name is Sister Carmela. She would bring me the Eucharist every day and we would talk about life, faith, Philomena, all the things. It was really beautiful. And during this time, I think God was really preparing me for what was to come because I really dove into my faith like I hadn't before. My prayer life was really healthy. I was praying the Memorare like pretty much just on repeat constantly all day long, just asking Our Lady to help me through this. And there were some really beautiful moments with it. I was terrified of being like lonely in a hospital. I was like, I'm going to be alone in this hospital. And that was like a silly fear because God sent me a visitor every single day. Even when I didn't know I would have a visitor Thanksgiving, someone would knock on my door and here would come in a family friend to say hi and to see how I was. And it was just, God really provided for us in that suffering. And then at 31 weeks, I started having very strong, very regular contractions. And they realized that I was in labor and that at that point, they don't try to stop the labor with medications, because they say they want to listen to the woman's body, that there may be a serious infection going on, because I'd been in the hospital for so long without any fluid. There was nothing protecting Philomena. I was a little bit dilated, nothing crazy. So I went into labor and she handled it well. And I think I was in labor for 48 hours. She was so small that I wasn't making changes. So it took a little while to get her out. And when she was here, she was born at 3:14, and she came out and she cried, which is great for a preemie. She was doing well. They had to intubate her. She didn't have any surfactant, but all things considered, she was doing really well. And they put her before me so I could see her at least, even though she was this little teeny tiny little peanut. She was 4 pounds, 1 ounce on April Fool's Day. So she was 401. And her birthday is always really funny to us, because I'm like, you really lived up to that, kiddo. Yeah. And the NICU had talked to us before we had her, and they gave us all the statistics for every week. And they're like, we knew 31 weeks, they're like the big kids in the NICU. They usually do really well. So we were prepared for that. My husband went with Philomena to the NICU and my mom stayed with me. And the plan was that an hour after delivery, as long as everything was going okay, then I could go down to the NICU and see Philomena. And about an hour after delivery, I was pumping. I should actually back up. After she was delivered, the placenta wasn't coming out. And it came out in shredded pieces. So instead of delivering an entire placenta, I was just passing pieces of placenta. So they did a bedside D&C, and they were pretty sure that they had gotten everything. But I was bleeding a little bit too much the whole time. So from them delivering the placenta to, and I'm like pumping about an hour after. And when I was pumping, I started contracting really strongly again. And my contractions the entire time had always been in my back. They were never really in my stomach too bad. The significant pain was in my back in a very specific spot. And at the time I thought it was just, this is back labor. Everybody goes through this. Well, not everybody, but a lot of women do. So that contraction started up again. And I let them know, I'm like, this is the pain is really high again, like it was in active labor. And I no longer had my epidural. And they're like, okay, you're bleeding a little bit more than we would like, nothing crazy. But if that contraction ever starts and then doesn't stop, you need to let us know right away. And then a few minutes later, that happened. It was like, just like this super strong grip, like inside something internally is what it felt like. And it was extremely painful. And then I started massively hemorrhaging. And it was like a whirlwind. They pulled the emergency cord and people started running into the room. And here comes the resident. And my husband was in the restroom. And they don't even tell me what they're doing. They just start a manual evacuation. So they're manually trying to remove what they thought was retained placenta. And they keep doing it. And my husband comes out and I am like hysterical. And every time the doctor would try to remove the placenta, she would hit that area of my uterus. And it was the worst pain you could possibly imagine, like a contraction times 50. So I started screaming. I don't even really remember screaming, but my family heard me screaming out in the waiting room. And I had made it very clear that my priority was to get to Philomena. I did not want to be put to sleep for a D&C. And the resident knew that. And she said, I can get this out. You can handle anything for 60 seconds. If we put you to sleep, it's going to be 5 hours before you can see your baby. So I let her keep trying. And this went on for about 30 minutes. And I was hemorrhaging the whole time. And a nurse actually pulled my mom aside and she said, she needs to go back for surgery or she is going to die. You have to insist that they call her actual doctor and that they do a surgery. So my mom did. She insisted, and my actual doctor came. They did the D&C, and they removed what they thought was retained placenta. But when they tried to inflate the brachy balloon, it wouldn't stay inflated. So they had to pack my uterus with gauze. So they sent me off to recovery, and I didn't wake up. I wasn't waking up. And my family was getting more increasingly concerned. They're like, why isn't she waking up? It's been hours. This is not normal. And they just said, it's just anesthesia. She's been through a lot. It might take a while. And then I started to wake up enough to say, there's something wrong. I'm still having the cramping. I'm having a lot of pain. I think I'm bleeding. And the nurses were like, you're not bleeding, honey. Everything is fine. Because when they would do the like fundal check, everything felt normal because of the gauze. They couldn't tell that I was still actively bleeding. So hours went by, and externally it looks like I'm sleeping, and my family was still just really concerned. They feel like something is wrong. And internally I am conscious, but unable to move my body. I can't move my hands. I can't open my eyes. I can't talk. I knew something was seriously wrong. And I could hear my family and the nurses talking around me. And I would like just build up just enough strength to say, something's wrong. I can't breathe. And the nurse kept telling me, it's just your anxiety, honey. You're fine. There's nothing wrong. You're fine. But eventually it got to the point where my blood pressure started dropping. And again, my family brought up concerns. They're like, there's something wrong. And the nurse was like, I think the blood pressure cuff just isn't reading it properly. And she turned the machine off. And then eventually my blood pressure got to around, it was somewhere in the range of 40/20, which is critically low. Like that's very low blood pressure. So my mom insisted that she basically told them, either you're calling her doctor, I'm calling her doctor. So they got the resident in there and they went to check what was happening. And when they removed, there was a piece of gauze, and they removed the gauze, and it was all of the blood that I had been bleeding for hours just came out. And it was like literally a scene from a movie. The doctor jumped up, ran out of the room. People started flooding into the room again. My blood pressure was still dropping. I wasn't stable enough for surgery. They got trauma nurses in there to start getting IVs going for blood product, because I had 2 IVs in, but I was losing blood faster than they could put it in. It took 2 hours for 2 trauma nurses to find a vein open enough to start more IVs. They had to bring in a vein finder. That didn't work. Then they had to bring in a sonogram machine before they finally were able to find veins open enough and to get the IV started, to get the blood product going so that I could go to surgery. And like all this time, they're like milking the bags of fluids to try and keep my veins open and blood going. Eventually, they were getting me stable for surgery. And before all of this, I had told my husband, I need a priest. I need our priest here. I think I'm dying and I need a priest. So he was frantically calling around, trying to get a hold of a priest, because for some reason, our Catholic hospital did not have a priest on call. This one day of the month that they don't have a priest on call is the day that this is happening. And so one of the other OBs that was at the hospital that day is also a parishioner at our church. And he was able to get a hold of someone who could get a hold of our priest. And he was like, you have a parishioner, she's in trouble, you need to get up here. So our priest was able to get up there just in the nick of time, which was a miracle too, that he was able to get there in time. So when all of this is happening, I'm waiting for the priest to get there. We're waiting for the blood products to work. The worst part of everything was I was incredibly thirsty. Like my throat was closing because there was no fluid left in my body. So it was like I was literally like choking on air. Like I would try to breathe and I couldn't take a breath in because there was nowhere for it to go. So I'm like begging them to let me have water. And they're like, you can't have water, you're going to surgery. And so they let my aunt dip a wash rag into a cup and just touch it to my tongue just enough so that I could take a breath. And then they would touch it to my tongue and then I'd take a breath. And the physical struggle happening with the blood loss was immense. Like I was in complete hemorrhagic shock. My doctor later told us I was at the point where my organs were starting to shut down. I am lucky I didn't go into a coma. It was very critical. So our priest gets there as they're getting me ready to transport me to the OR. And at this point, I couldn't move. Like I could open my eyes a little bit, but I could barely move my body. I was so weak. So he comes in and he starts to do the anointing. And I remember trying to make the sign of the cross with him and I couldn't lift my arm. And as soon as he touched my head with the oils, I smelled the most beautiful smell you could possibly imagine. It was like chrism oil mixed with roses and just like fresh. And it was like life breathed back into my body. And I could make the sign of the cross, and I could talk, and I could move, and my entire family was there, and I could hold my husband's hand again, and he was able to walk with me to the OR, and it was truly miraculous. And at the time, I thought, oh, this is just what the anointing oils smell like. But I later found out that they don't have a smell. Only the chrism oil has a smell. And I realized, okay, that was a God moment. That was Mother Mary there with me. So they get me back to the OR, and my doctor, she was like rubbing my leg and like telling me like, I'm not going to let you die, honey. We're not going to let you die. And I can remember the OR perfectly. Like she was standing like where she was standing, where the nurses were standing. And I remember the anesthesiologist saying, who's going to prep her throat? And right when a nurse started like pushing on my throat, it was like everything slowed down. And I could feel the devil presenting my sins. Look at everything you've done. You are not worthy to me, God. You're not. How could you stand before him when your soul looks like this? And I could see the way my sins had affected me. And I could clearly see that I had not done enough for God. And it was terrifying. Like I was legitimately, it wasn't that I was scared to die. It was that I was scared to go before Jesus as I was. And my prayer the entire time during this, I was praying the entire time I couldn't talk, the entire time I couldn't move. I was just praying Our Fathers and Hail Marys and just asking God to not let me die. I wanted to meet my daughter. I wanted to actually be able to hold her. I hadn't even held her yet. But in that moment, my prayers changed. It was me begging Our Lady to ask God to give me another chance because I hadn't done enough for her son yet. And I wanted that opportunity to do more for him. And I knew if I died then, I would never get it. And as I'm just praying with everything I have in my soul, and I start to feel the medicine like literally crawl through my body. And then I fall asleep and I wake up in the ICU. And they tell me, you lost a lot of blood. We were able to save your uterus, which was a miracle too. And they let me know you're going to be in the ICU for a while. They were like saying like 24 hours. And I'm like, okay, like just shocked, first of all, that I'm alive, and also shocked that they were able to keep my uterus. And they allowed my husband and my parents, my sisters to come in and see me. And then I fell back asleep, obviously, anesthesia. And I woke up a little bit later and was a little bit more clear-headed. And I was like, okay, I get to see my baby. What do I have to do to get out of this ICU? You need to walk, you need to go to the bathroom, you need to eat something. And once you can do all of those things well, then we'll let you leave the ICU. And I did all of it, and I got out of the ICU in 5 hours.
Wow.
I was like, I am going to see my baby today. So I got to see Philomena that afternoon. I think it was probably around 5 o'clock. My sister-in-law came up to help my husband get me to the NICU, and Philomena's doing awesome. She had some normal complications that preemies would have. She had Brady's, where your heart rate and your oxygen dip, things like that, just not being a fully mature newborn. She was in the NICU until May when we were able to bring her home. And everything that happened didn't really hit me until months later. It was just a very like adrenaline rush, like Philomena's in the NICU. I am healing. We're trying to get her healthy so she can come home. And it didn't really hit me all of the spiritual things that happened during her delivery. It really sat with me later, that everything that I was allowed to experience. And at the time, for a while, I was really angry on this journey of really sitting with everything that happened in her delivery. I can really see now that I'm more far removed from it, the way God used that suffering to heal so many wounds for me.
helping others not feel alone as God uses us in His glory. That's Katie Axelson on this week's Springs in the Desert. If you want the full conversation or to go back and see what you might have missed, check it out at EWTN.com/podcast or subscribe to Springs in the Desert wherever you stream. I'm Ace McKay. When Catholics Coast to Coast returns, if you're feeling restless, we have a great podcast, literally by the same name. But when we speak of others or to others about their gifts and their flaws, is it gossip? Is it distractions? What are the things that are becoming destructive and how we can better lift others up in the image of God? We're going to find out more from Restless when Catholics Coast to Coast returns.
The destination for great Catholic audio programming is EWTN Podcast Central, featuring the best of EWTN radio, as well as faith-filled podcasts from our friends and affiliates across the nation, all in one place, all free. If it's central to the faith, you can find it on EWTN Podcast Central. It's like podcast heaven. Visit EWTN.com/radio/podcasts today.
Welcome back to Restless. My name is Father Joseph Gill, priest of the Diocese of Bridgeport, Connecticut. You've joined Matt, who's losing it over there.
I'm laughing because I was hoping that your intro you would just start detracting. You'd just start ripping into the two of us.
Well, he hasn't gotten to me yet. Maybe he's
Well,
going to.
detraction.
Be patient, Matt.
Detraction means the person's not in the room, right?
Oh, does it?
Does it? Or I don't know. I don't know. Like talking behind someone's back.
I mean, that's probably
I see.
the primary way it occurs, but I definitely am good enough at detraction to do
detract.
it.
We just talked about how people can't even look people in the eye, right? So there's no way they're detracting.
Someone
right
who's
in
really
front of
clever can detract from somebody without them knowing about it.
Yeah.
Well, that's
For sure.
true. That's
For sure.
true. Yeah. I mean, like we could talk about like Matt's beard.
But I think you
you
might
want.
be aware of that, though.
Yeah.
His beard?
Yeah,
Yeah.
but if we were to talk about
Now
bearded
you're-
people in general and the various moral failings,
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Most bearded people.
yeah, having freshly been clean shaven not that long ago, but
That's true. Yeah.
I lost the beard, so
I almost just said, not so clever, huh? But that would have been detraction. Right in front of you.
but luckily you said I almost said, and therefore
no, see,
anything
And
after that
I
is
don't
yeah,
think
this is
canceled
the
out,
equivalent of no offense.
I don't think detraction is the same as an insult. I think detraction is kind of more
Is it
purposely
not? I mean-
behind.
So I think an insult's probably a species of detraction, if I had to guess.
I would have to look at Aquinas on that one. I don't know, but I
What does he know?
always thought detraction was simply just speaking about someone negatively when they're not
Interesting.
there,
I see.
behind,
Okay.
behind
all
their
right.
back.
Well, let's work with.
We
So
should
let's
work that out
work
before
with,
the episode
yeah.
started, I think. What actually detraction was. That would have been a really good thing to already have worked out by us, I think. This is how professional
Yeah.
we are.
Yes,
We're still figuring out what we're talking about
Exactly.
in the episode.
That's not true. We actually have a great plan, and I hope you stay tuned. Don't just delete us right now.
Or you could listen to the tangent.
You definitely shouldn't do that.
Let's detract from
Yeah.
the tangent. All right.
Yeah. We can all agree that nobody should do that.
Yeah.
Anyway, they don't rib on us as much as we rib on them.
The tangent.
Yeah. Have you ever
Probably
brought up
some of our
Restless?
insecurity, probably.
I would say we brought you up a couple times.
Oh, good. Hopefully.
Yeah.
Adulation.
It's actually
Great
funny enough. It's
positive
usually,
ways, right?
It's usually when we're not recording and it's a joke behind your guys' back.
So it is detraction.
Yeah,
All right, that's
but
fair,
but
that's
it's
fair.
a joke. It is a well-intended joke.
So okay, so that
Yeah.
is an interesting distinction
Caveat.
we need to
Yeah,
make
yeah.
right now, right? So Aquinas talked about a jocular lie, right? Like if I were to go up to you and say, "Hey, guess what, man? Pigs are flying," right? You would
Yeah,
kind of know
yeah.
that's a joke,
Yeah.
right? I mean, so
So I'm an idiot.
is it okay? Like, is it okay to say something negative about somebody that everyone else knows is a joke? And that happens to me all the time because so I just finished teaching another year. One of the consistent feedback I always ask at the end of the year if the kids can give me some feedback on how I can be a better teacher.
Mhm.
Inevitably, one or two students will write on a little card. They'll say, stop making mean jokes.
Right.
Because I like to rib the kids pretty hard.
Yeah, I know.
And so like last year, I started off the year by saying, look, guys, I got the feedback that I need to stop making mean jokes, so I'm going to stop doing that. And all of the boys, only the boys, are like, no, that's the
Right.
best part of class.
Right,
we love
right,
it. You
right,
keep
yeah.
tearing us down. Because I could like walk into class and be like, hey, Edward, you're fat. And he would bust out laughing. You know, obviously I can't say that to a girl.
Notably, Edward isn't very fat. It's
Edward is
worth
not
noting.
fat. No, Edward is very, thin. So and that's why I
Very
said,
athletic person.
but that's why I said jocular lie. Because if
Yeah.
I made fun of like Edward's, I don't know,
Right.
nose and his bad nose, like
Yeah.
that would not be as
Does Edward
funny.
have a bad nose?
No, his
Okay,
nose
there
is
you
rather,
go. Right.
average, I would say.
Okay. Fair enough.
So
But yes.
does it matter how the person takes it, or?
Yeah, I do think that there's an extent to which offense is taken, not given, at least in some situations. But at the same time,
Most Aquinas says, he says communication is given according to the mode of the receiver.
Right. And so, so I think it's also just important as the speaker to, try to have some appreciation for the person to whom you're speaking, and, how are they going to receive this? Maybe, maybe someone who is a little overweight, maybe you could joke with them about a lot of things, but that's not one thing you shouldn't joke with them about. And so that's fine, right?
There are some things you cross the line.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I think it's important to really, be prudent in the way that you want to have a relationship with somebody. The first time you meet somebody, you shouldn't be making fun of them. Certainly not in a severe way, right? I mean, it's one, there's sort of like the common kind of male sort of like ribbing that is sort of light enough that it's generally speaking accepted, I think. But I have friends, with whom I can make, much more what would sound like very harsh jokes if you weren't part of the friend group. But in the friend group, we all understand that this is a joke based on this thing that we all have the shared experience of, and it's fine.
Right. Maybe people make fun of my bald head all the time,
but
and I'm totally fine with that. Like,
I will say this happened to me before, where you make those jokes about somebody, and then a third party hears it, and they interpret it as you being mean to that person, and they'll make it. Then and this can be a real problem. So even though it's the case that maybe among friends a joke is okay, it might also be the case that in mixed company that's not a joke you make. You wait until you're in private, and then we're all friends here. But especially I think for you as a priest, for me as a seminarian, I've tried to really scale back some of the jokes I might otherwise make, because it's like, all right, this is objectively probably innocuous enough, but some pious person is going to hear it and get really worked up about it, and I don't want to scandalize them or create a headache or something like that.
That's an issue. Yeah, I mean, I made a.
You don't have to confess your sins on the air.
For example,
there's a bad joke I made.
That's right.
No, but also you have to consider like what sometimes we think that it's not causing harm to the person, but I remember growing up, I had a friend named Charlie who was like the brunt of all our jokes, and he laughed about it, and he was like, he was like a mediocre sports player and just kind of like a short kid, and so we always kind of made fun of him and everything. In fact, we had what we called the triple crown of insults. It was you're fat, you're ugly, and no one likes you. And so we'd just be like, hey Charlie, you just won the triple crown. Like that would be like that.
Ouch.
Be the joke.
Yeah.
So fast forward to like 10 years later, I see him posting on Facebook saying, guys, this is the 1-year anniversary of my suicide attempt.
Oh my gosh.
And I was like, my jaw hit the floor, and I'm like, holy cow. Like, Charlie, I had no idea you were struggling with this. Like, and I don't think he was struggling with it when I knew him as, a 13, 14-year-old.
Right. Yeah.
But you have to wonder, did that, contribute to some of his negative thoughts that ended up going down a bad path?
Yeah.
And he's, thankfully he's, doing alive and well now, but
on a path of healing, hopefully.
Yeah.
But I never knew,
But that's why it has to be predicated on an actual relationship where there's mutual affection. Like one of the priests in seminary, the priest I lived with my first year, he's sort of famous for this in homilies. He's extremely truly the holiest man I've ever met in my life. Very good man, wonderful homilist, and he loves to kind of work in little like house jokes, and it was not evenly distributed. By which I mean, like, I don't know how bell curves work exactly, but whatever the most is, that was where I was situated, and then it was sort of declining from there. But it was fine because I knew that he respected me, right? Because he and I had a great relationship, and so in his last homily in the year, he made 3 jokes at my expense.
Oh my goodness!
Even homily, but it was hysterical, and I actually, to be honest, looked forward to it because it was a funny thing. The whole house could get a laugh out of it. It wasn't mean spirited. But there are people he didn't do that for. And I'm sure it's because he was smart enough to know that person really would not receive it well. You know what I mean?
At the same time, I wonder if the other people felt left out because they weren't included in the joke. Because I've had that experience too, where people have been joking with each other, and I'm like,
it's like The Office where Mike says, man, like, I love inside jokes. I'd love to be a part of one day.
Right. Right.
Right.
It's interesting too. I mean, if you're looking to the saints, right? Like St. Philip Neri, famously used humor as a manner of humility, and there's an author named Dr. Holly Ordway who wrote a biography of Tolkien, and in that biography she says that Tolkien really tried to emulate that, whereby almost to the point where she expresses that she was shocked at how like foolish he was willing to make himself look to develop humility. Now the thing is. And I have attempted that before. Just like you tease yourself, and
that's always a safe.
Right, and well, that's what I'm saying. Is that the alternative, basically, that you make fun of yourself so as to not make fun of someone else and potentially either scandalize or hurt?
I will never forget one school I was teaching. There was a 6th grade boy who walked in one day with a big sign around his neck that said "loser," And now this is one like the cool kids, like he was athletic, everyone liked him. And I was like, James, like take that off, man. You're not a loser. He said, I know, but I want to wear it so that kids make fun of me and not each other. I was like, wow, that's really awesome. Like, wish I had that courage, you know?
I do think that there is one risk to making fun of yourself, which is that it can be a way to solicit compliments.
Yeah.
You know, so, I'm sorry, like, I look terrible today. Meanwhile, like, you actually put a lot of effort into your outfit and you're trying to solicit a compliment. And it can be done subconsciously where it's like, I don't know, I'm sorry, my homily was probably terrible. I'm sorry to make you listen to it. It's like, actually, Father, your homily was very, very good. That's what they're going to say.
Right.
So, you know what, maybe just, so I actually, that's something I try to avoid because that was actually a tool that I would use a lot to try to set people at ease would be to kind of make fun of myself or something like that, or to apologize sort of like jokingly for things. Then I realized that people the response that people would have is just to compliment me or something like that. And just
you're a genius.
You're the best
ever. So actually what I try to do now is avoid that self-consciously if I think it's going to lead to that, you know.
That reminds me of C.S. Lewis's definition of humility. He said, humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of yourself less.
Sure.
What a great insight, right? It's just, and a true saint, doesn't make themselves the center of attention, positive or negative, really. They, they glorify God and, using yourself as an example only when necessary.
Right.
And so I try, especially in homilies, like a lot of priests will just talk about themselves and their life, and I try not to do that very much.
Really? I don't know if I've noticed that. Maybe, I mean, well,
you go to good mass.
Yeah. Who are the people I've heard preach the most in the last like 2 years? Well, you, and Father Suarez. So
growing up, I had
he's a good homilist.
And I hope this isn't detraction. I'm trying to use an example. He's since deceased. A good man, a good and very holy man who baptized me, gave me my first communion. But he was in recovery and was very, very upfront about the fact that he was an alcoholic and struggling with that. And so like almost every homily, he'd bring up some story about him in recovery, and like, well, that's really inspiring. But like after the 10th one, you're like, all right, I kind of know where this is going.
Right.
That's funny. Yeah.
All right, so we talked about humor, but the question is, when is it appropriate to even sometimes bring up someone else's flaws? And I can think of two instances that I get questions about a lot. First of all, so I teach in a school, and as you know, Matt used to teach there as well. And in the teachers' lounge, we would often have to talk about students. Gosh, can you believe what so and so did today? Or like, you need to know that this so and so is struggling with X, and like,
right.
I mean, do I really need to know that? I don't know, but so
is detraction just? I know that we were trying to clarify the term before, but is detraction not only an insult, but also potentially basically oversharing? You're giving knowledge that
I think detraction can be true. And it can be problematic.
Here's the definition. I had to go look it up. Here's the definition from Merriam-Webster. Detraction is a lessening of reputation or esteem, especially by envious, malicious, or petty criticism.
Yeah. Right.
Or a taking away, detracting one's good reputation among others.
Right. So, like, because the reason I ask is because there could very well be a situation where one professional. I mean, teacher is a good example because it's with kids, and like if it's a kid, it's a particularly sensitive example.
Mm-hmm.
But you could say this colleague or this student is struggling with suicidal thoughts. Like, we know this, and I'm letting you know so you can keep an eye out. And the truth is, to an extent, right, that might decrease, quote unquote, like the perceived reputation of a person, because it's not a good thing to be struggling with that. Like, right. I now know an illness you have.
Yeah.
Right. But obviously that's not malicious.
At the same time, we have a demerit system at our school where if you just break have an infraction, you get a demerit, and that the demerits are published for all the teachers to see.
Right.
So I can go on there and see, Johnny got 6 demerits this month,
right.
and they tell me exactly what it's for. So it's
right.
like, do I need that? I mean, should I look at that? I
yeah.
mean, because it does help a little bit being like, okay, Johnny's really struggling in this area. Maybe it's talking in class, or
right. Right. 5 out of 6,
not turning in homework on time, and like, okay, well then I can give him a little extra TLC in that area. But at the same time, like, is it better to not know it so that I don't necessarily come in with a preconceived notion and he loses reputation in my sight?
To be honest, I would actually say you probably don't need to know that. I think somebody in the school probably needs to have all of it so that it's not the case that somebody's going around breaking the same rule with different people.
Right.
Getting away
which does happen.
But probably not the case that every teacher needs to see that. And frankly,
yeah.
It probably does lead. I mean, it's a human thing, right? You see something about somebody, and it affects how you treat them. So
it does.
This last semester, we were teaching. I had a couple classes I had to teach 8th graders in the Catholic school about different things. One of them was about the 10 Commandments, and I remember reading through the catechism sections on it. I don't have it all at my fingertips, but I remember what I essentially came up with for them was you have to think to yourself like, all right, A, is what I'm about to say true? B, is it really my right to share it? And C, like, why am I doing this? Is this something that the person I'm telling it to has a right to know? Is it meant to be helpful, or because you can say something about something that's true, and maybe even it's something that they did to you that was wrong, and so you almost kind of feel like you have this sort of moral, kind of like permission to share it.
Yeah.
But why are you sharing it? Are you sharing it because like you're venting? Are you sharing it because you want to alert the other person about potential risk or something like that? Or are you sharing because you want to shape the way your present interlocutor views the person you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
So I almost ought to be like, yeah.
You are in good company, because that sounds exactly like what Aristotle said. He said the three gates are: is it true, is it necessary, is it kind?
Right.
So great minds think alike, and also way to go for using the word interlocutor in a conversation.
Thank you.
Those props.
It's only for the compliment, so I appreciate that you recognize that.
Fishing for that one.
But I frankly, I'll speak about myself, because why not?
Because I'm basically the best.
Right. It's about the thing I know the most
Aristotle,
about.
Joe.
That's right. Sure.
Well, clearly they think alike.
We'll address the ranking of those later. But I know that
He's dead and you're alive.
I enjoy making people laugh, right? But I know that about myself that I can take that too far, and I can use that as an excuse. So, I mean, a dozen times a day at least, I'll share something to get a cheap laugh, and I'm like, that was just to get a cheap laugh. I shouldn't have done that. And literally last night, I began to share it with the priest I live with, something a parishioner had done that was a parishioner that annoys me had done that I thought was funny and that was stupid of her to do. And I started, and I was like, okay, you have to stop. There's no reason for you to share what you're about to share. So I just kind of aborted the sentence when I was that's atypical. So to be honest, right? So like this is in my own life. This is a constant like every night at the exam. It's like I probably didn't need to tell that story. Probably need to tell that joke. Probably didn't need to share what that person had done. So it can be difficult in the moment, because
it can be.
You're in the conversation. You want to have something to say. You say, all of a sudden you're like, that wasn't really mine to share, or that wasn't really a charitable thing to say.
More silence is less sin, really, a lot of times. But
that's so hard.
Yeah, but it's such a struggle. I mean, I walk out of school every time, and it's a lot of times with conversation like, oh, I shouldn't have said this, shouldn't have said that.
And frankly, sometimes people do things that are so obnoxious to you that you're like, I cannot believe I had to go sit through that. Like, I have to complain to somebody. Like, to be honest, sometimes sometimes that makes it difficult. It's like I feel like I have the right to complain about this to somebody.
So
maybe you don't. Maybe you don't. You know what I mean?
So that's an important question, though, right? So is venting ever appropriate?
I know that there are some who say yes and some who say no.
But what do you say?
Because it is a relief, right? It's a relief to share one's burden with another human being.
So I would say this, and this is literally just for me. So you don't get to do
your morality is not your morality is not my morality.
Subjectivism. No. I'm an external processor, which means that I have to. Like ironically, we ended up not doing the family life episode today, but in order to prepare for that episode, which we didn't do today, I was like, Renee, I need to talk to you about this subject. I cannot, I have to say it out loud. Otherwise, my thoughts are going to be all jumbled, and I'm going to be figuring it out on the spot like I am right now.
Most wives are saying to their husbands, what's on your mind? What are you thinking about? Renee never says that with Matt. We know exactly what's on his mind at all times.
Actually, can you talk about yourself less?
Keep it in.
We had been dating for like 6 weeks, and I was like, Renee, this is great. We are so good at communicating. She was like, no. You're good at talking. I'm good at listening.
Right. And that's what you need in a relationship.
I was like, yeah, it's perfect.
Talker.
Right, but so I have to, because it would be clearly very unhealthy for me to keep something that is eating away at me inside, bottled up for the rest of my life, and then I die. Right, that's a John Mulaney joke that he talks about how Irish people keep their anger bottled up, and then they die, and that's how it ends. Right, but that's
that may be true.
Right. That's like an inappropriate, course to take. So I have to talk about it out loud. Now the thing is, does that then allow me to then be unbelievably mean? Of course not.
Well, what about writing it in a journal or talking it out loud to God?
Right. Well, so I do try and do that. And probably maybe I should exclusively do that.
Well, I think if that's not going to be enough, then I do think it's worth finding one person who you can actually trust to keep things to themselves. Everybody thinks,
right.
I'm telling you this in confidence. Like, all right, well, you just told me all the juicy thing, then you said I'm telling it to you in confidence. Maybe if you'd led with that, I would have said, don't tell me at all. You know what I mean? So
right.
And, everybody thinks, I can tell one person. So it's actually important to have somebody be like, all right, this actually does need to die with you. I need to get off my chest.
I've got a spiritual director. You got a spiritual director, and you got a spiritual director, and with spiritual direction. that's what the whole thing is. I can vent to my spiritual director.
Right.
Because I do need his advice.
Right.
And
the other time I think it can be permissible, obviously sort of, given that it's done as most charity as possible, to rant or to vent about something is if it could actually affect a change. So for example, I'll avoid giving specifics, but this last year,
bad things happened.
I was afflicted with a particularly awful human formation conference day situation. And I was the whole day, I was almost shaking with anger at how unseriously it was taken and how much of a waste of my time it was.
Right.
And what was the topic?
I'm not gonna, because people won't know.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I'll tell you off air. But
okay, fair.
But so
can I know too? No, I'm sorry.
I'm gonna tell Father. He'll tell you. Okay?
Yeah.
That's how it works.
I was so angry about it, and I was trying to avoid complaining about it. A, just to avoid complaining. B, because there were some other reasons why I was trying to avoid complaining about it. But I was like, I need to tell somebody. So I told my spiritual director, who also happens to be involved with planning these things. I was like, Father, I need to tell you this because it was so profoundly insulting to me that I was forced to sit through this that it just can't be allowed to happen again. And so I went on for like a good 10 minutes about it. I'm gonna be honest. And Father can tell you, like, I have a very colorful way of complaining about things. Sometimes I can muster the English language to really distract on things if I really want to.
If you use interlocutor in a sentence,
so I went on
clearly.
So I went on for a period of time, and I was like, all right,
mastery of the language.
That's all I want to say. I needed to say it. It's off my chest now. And he's like, great. I feel like that was fine. Like, I feel like you didn't take it too far or anything. I hear you. I agree with you in part. So I think in that situation where you're like, this could actually lead to change. Yeah. But that's different from saying, like, I'm going to complain about something for an hour. It's like, would you tell him this? I'm not going to tell him this. I'm telling you this. Like, well,
that's fair.
Unless you think I'm going to tell him this, then all you're doing is complaining about him. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, there's been different times I've spoken with, particularly like the principal at the school.
Yeah.
The student, and it has changed, has made an impact in terms of changing the way we address this issue.
Yeah, same.
Trying to help understand.
I mean, and the thing is, you could also go to your superior about a colleague, and I don't mean like just to complain, but if there's an actual infraction occurring,
Yes, but doesn't Jesus say, right, go to your brother first?
Sure.
Now that's hard.
Yeah.
That's hard. How do you do that? Have you ever had to do that? I mean,
not for a colleague, or at least I haven't for a colleague.
Yeah, I think the colleague bit is important because like power differentials, I think, can change the equation a little bit. This is something actually I've been thinking a lot about because there's a situation in seminary where there's a particular person that I really had an issue with, and I had the opportunity to have like a sort of a public, to make a comment about the thing I was aggravated about publicly, but I felt like I needed to talk to them about it personally. So I asked my spiritual director about it, and what we basically decided was, like, if you're going to do it public, you have to also confront him about it first. And so I decided to hold off because this person is in a position of authority, and I decided, well, I'm not really done with, like, we're not really done with, our relationship's not done. I don't want to put myself in a position to be reciprocated against, or him in the position to have to, like, fight against that temptation. So I felt like this can wait for now. But I was trying to take. I think it's important to take seriously that you can't just immediately go over someone's head in every situation. I think sometimes you have to, if you're talking about your immediate supervisor, maybe confronting them just isn't an option, right? Because they have the power to make your life miserable.
Miserable, yeah.
Right.
And especially if you have reason to believe that that's something they're going to do. But I do think that means going to their supervisor and not to your colleagues or to their peers.
Right.
You know what I mean? It still, I think, requires you actually doing something that could, because I think probably part of the point of that whole thing is to channel the things you want to complain about to actually changing them. So,
right. That should be the goal.
Yeah. So not just like, I'm going to complain to you about it, but I'm going to complain to the person who could change it.
That's a great insight.
Yeah. And I do think that there is something to be said for in those moments, right? You can be really heated, So, like, in the heat of the moment, maybe you don't have the presence of mind to say, well, I'm going to do this instead of this. And so you take that. It's almost like a safe route, where you say, you know what, I'm going to the superior who can make the change that I can't change to try and fix an injustice.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, because if I don't do that, I'm going to boil over. And it's going to explode, and it's going to be way worse for everybody involved, myself, them, my superior. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
I think one of the keys that all of us can work on cultivating is to receive that kind of correction well. And that's hard. When someone comes up to us and say, hey, you need to do this differently.
Yeah.
Oof, you kind of just take the bristle.
Yeah.
Because it may not be motivated by a good motivation, but there might be a kernel of truth in it.
Yes.
how to have a discussion with others without falling into sin. Great help this week from our friends at Restless. If you want to get more of this conversation or ones you might have missed, go to EWTN.com/podcast, because Podcast Central is where all of these conversations are hanging out, and you can do the same. You can also share, like, subscribe, follow. That way you don't miss what's to come in future episodes. I'm Ace McKay. Going to dive out. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and we'll see you again next time. Remember to let God define who you are. And thanks again for hanging out with Catholics Coast to Coast.